Hello and welcome to this pre-recorded panel on the film God in Green, which we bring to you in honor of the film's premiere showing at the Virginia Film Festival 2020. I'm Kurtis Schaeffer, Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia and co-director with my colleague Martine Halverson-Taylor of the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab here at UVA. The Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab commissioned this film in the hopes of contributing to the national conversation about the intersection of four areas of our shared public life: environment, religion, race, and politics. If you would like to know more about the film or the lab's work, you can visit us at religionlab.virginia.edu. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to offer thanks to the lab's program manager, Ashley Duffalo, for making this panel possible, and to the University of Virginia for making the film itself possible. And now, if I can ask all of our panelists to join us, I will introduce them. I'm joined by three guests today. Anthea Butler is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. A sought-after commentator on the BBC, MSNBC, CNN, the History Channel, and PBS, Professor Butler regularly writes opinion pieces covering religion, race, politics, and popular culture for the NBC Think, Religion News Service, The Washington Post, and CNN, among others. She is author of the forthcoming book, White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America, which should be on our virtual bookshelves in 2021. Darren Dochuk is the Andrew V. Tax College Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame. Dochuk's research deals primarily with the United States in the long 20th century, with emphasis on the intersections of religion, politics, and culture in national life. Dochuk has written widely on modern US history. His most recent book is Anointed with Oil: How Christianity and Crude Made Modern America, published by Basic Books in 2019. Jeanine Butler is an award-winning director, producer, and writer, and co-founder of Butler Films, which produced a feature-length documentary on evangelical social life and politics titled American Heretics, as well as our short, today's film, God in Green, An Unholy Alliance, which we're thrilled to debut at the Virginia Film Festival. I'll ask a series of questions, some to all of the panelists, some to particular panelists. This session should last anywhere between 30 and 35 minutes. So let's dive in. Anthea, I'd like to start out by asking you a question. The film tells a big story in a small space of time. It's a story about race, economics, environment, and religion. Now, how in plain terms can we start to think, to talk about these not as disparate subjects, but as related aspects of life today?
Thanks, Kurtis. Thanks for having me for this panel. It's a great film. And I think we can begin to talk about these things in terms of holistically about life. Right now, we're faced with a crisis. We're faced with coronavirus, and that is intersecting climate. We have to pay attention to how the air is. We have to pay attention to the people who are being most hurt by the coronavirus. There's lots of different ways in which we can bring together the politics, the environment, race, and justice in the midst of all of this, and especially evangelicalism. So I think the first way to start to talk about this is to think about the ways currently in which these things are operating, and especially in our election cycle right now. We have a disparate way between the two parties about how people see these things, whether that's about wanting to save the environment, wanting to think about climate change, wanting to think about the effects of that on communities, and how churches or other religious groups are dealing with that, vis-a-vis others who want to see us, strip down the Alaska wilderness, make more room for oil, make more room for different kinds of things, in order to put forth a capitalistic notion of what we should be doing with climate change, the environment, and race, and et cetera. And so I think the ways in which we can start to bring this, especially into places in our common everyday conversation, as well as the classroom and other places, is to take a harsh assessment and a good look at where we are right now and how the environment is actually affecting us in the midst of the pandemic.
Good, thank you. Darren, I want to ask you the same question.
Great, thanks, Kurtis, and
yeah.
Really good to be with you all, Anthea and Jeanine and Ashley, and what an excellent film. Very excited to be part of this project, important project. So, sure, and I've been working on this a question of this sort for a number of years with the oil book, and this big story does boil down to a very small space, a local space, and I guess that's what I would emphasize at this juncture. First of all, what does it mean to live on an oil patch? And if we want to try to understand, as Anthea has suggested, encouraged us to do in this moment, we've just had a president who is campaigning through Texas saying, we've got to protect God, guns, and oil, right? I mean, this is the triumvirate that he is protecting. So why does that resonate? And I guess I would just encourage all of us to understand the degree to which living in an oil patch kind of resonates at every level, whether it's about work, whether it's about play, whether it's about politics, or whether it's about worship. There's a way in which an attachment to this kind of carbon industry, this carbon economy, shapes the entire way in which people within the oil patch live. And so on one hand, yes, it's about rallying reform across America and in these places itself, but it's also about realizing just how attached we are to that. So it's about race, it's about economics, and it's very much about environment and religion. And we really need to appreciate just the depths to which these commitments are shaping our day-to-day existence. And that goes through funding, it goes through the finances, the ways in which the politics of these places are also shaped by commitment to oil money, for instance. So ecology matters, the relationship of a community to land and its resources matter, and that includes at the congregational level.
Good, thank you. Jeanine, when we came to you and said, we think we want to commission a film about four things: environment, race, politics, and religion, your eyes kind of got wide, and we said we want to do it in 20 minutes. And then you took a deep breath and you pulled it off over the last 6 months. So can you give us some insight about how you pulled these threads together in the space of a 20-minute film?
Well, first of all, under great stewardship from you and your team, and it's a real pleasure working with the lab and with UVA. And of course, the generosity and expertise of Darren and Anthea and all the people, all the voices that were in this piece. And it was a daunting task, especially in the middle of COVID, because we couldn't approach it the way we normally would, go on location, develop relationships, find different stories. And so we sent our camera packages out to these fine folks who did such a good job setting it up and putting themselves on camera. And I think the biggest challenge was to take the big subjects, those big subjects, and we could have focused on any one of the little stories that are represented in this 20 minutes. They could be their own series, really, the subject matters in here. And it was a hard decision to say, do we go very narrow, or do we say we've got 20 minutes? We know we want to look at a particular period of history and its impact, but that can bleed the lines a little bit, go back a little bit farther. And do we want to include a variety of voices of people whose expertise looks at this and studies it, and other people who may be living the repercussions of it? And I think we thought, well, for 20 minutes, let's try it a different way. Let's include a lot of voices. And some of that was partly inspired by Reverend Mariama Hammond White's feeling and passion for the fact that you have to understand your history. You have to have some context to really understand what's going on today. And so that's how we tackled it. And I think up until the very end, we weren't quite sure if it was going to be this very neat and tidy 20 minutes. And it probably isn't, but the idea to introduce different themes and different perspectives and different ideas excited us and excited you. So that's how we went about it.
Good, thanks. No, it's a remarkably polyphonous and harmonious collection of voices. So I think it was a good gamble. So I would like to get into a couple of details, and much of this comes from me wanting to know more from you, Darren, and you, Anthea, about the topics of the film. So if I can start with Darren, I'd like to ask you to take us once again through that distinction between civil religion of Crude and wildcat Christianity, this distinction you make. Civil religion of Crude epitomized by the Rockefeller family, wildcat Christianity characterized best by the Stewart family and Union Oil. And I ask you to elaborate on this a little bit more because it strikes me that this is an important distinction to understand as we look to the future of distinct religious understandings of climate science and visions of climate action, especially in the economic context that you're always paying attention to. Sure.
Well, it's the driving tension in my book, and it's not necessarily the only tension, but it really is one that progresses from the beginning of the oil industry in the mid-19th century to the present day, and it's one between kind of large integrated multinational oil corporations and the more kind of fiercely independent smaller producers, which make a home in Texas, Oklahoma, and California after 1900. They're driven out of Pennsylvania, which is the first oil kind of frontier of the United States of America in the 19th century. They're driven out by the Rockefellers, they're driven out by Standard Oil, and they go looking elsewhere for their profits. And they're going to find them with some spectacular oil booms across the Southwest. So this leads to a competition really throughout the entirety of the 20th century. It's a competition that plays out in the oil industry itself, that between kind of the Standard Oil monopoly, Major Oil, and that of these smaller independent oil companies plays out in our realm of Christianity and Christian politics as well. The Rockefellers really trying to impose kind of order and their own monopolistic ways in American Protestantism, competing with what would ultimately become a fiercely independent evangelical movement that is opposed to big government, that is opposed to big corporations, and that is opposed to anything big, including ecumenism and philanthropy within the Christian realm. And so the book charts the tension between these two. It's of course the Rockefellers versus the Stewarts, and then of course throughout the 20th century, the Pew family as well, which will fund a number of important evangelical causes. So that is the tension, and it does, I think, resonate with where we are today. The Rockefellers, Rockefeller Jr. especially, the second generation, would use the profits of the Rockefeller Standard monopoly to fund philanthropies, charities across the globe that were very much in tune with kind of the new science of the day. They would respect science, they would respect new medicines, and try to kind of uplift humanity on a global scale through the application of this new knowledge. That would always be resisted in part because of the politics of oil and Christianity by these wildcat evangelicals of the Southwest who would try to do things their way. They would focus on kind of a plain folk kind of interpretation of scripture, always fiercely independent in the way they approached God on their terms as they approached their own land and resources. And so this tension between kind of this cosmopolitan internationalist Christianity sponsored by the Rockefellers and this more fiercely independent evangelicalism sponsored by the Pews and the Hunts and the Stewarts is one that I think explains a lot about the religious and political tensions within American Christianity for the last 100 years.
One of the fascinating things to me about that distinction and the influence of that distinction that you made is the extent to which it's created not just powerful Christian identities, but powerful social and political identities too, that are at odds at the moment in many ways, but are very, very powerful. We don't often think about the deep economic engines that assist in maintaining those.
Very much, and it plays out, of course, within economics. It plays out within the Republican Party, and if we want to try to figure out how the Republican Party's trajectory has changed since the early 1960s, we can look to this tension between these two kind of brands of petro-Protestantism, if you will. Barry Goldwater being really the breakthrough for this kind of wildcat Christianity in the political realm within the GOP in 1964, coming up against and defeating ultimately the Rockefeller branch. And today we still see this tension between kind of a mainline Republicanism and a much more fervent wildcat conservative Republicanism based in Texas and Oklahoma. That's very much fueled by religious as much as political values.
And thank you. I want to turn to Anthea now and ask you to lead us into a fuller discussion moving into this film, but also beyond this film, about structural racism. In the film, Reverend Mariama White-Hammond names the fact that structural racism guarantees that some will be hurt by the climate emergency more than others. As an example, the film quotes Ashish Jha, director of the Harvard Global Health Institute, who states that African Americans breathe air that is 50% more polluted than whites. And that Black and brown people will suffer the brunt of the climate change we're witnessing is a fact now. How do we successfully link environmental action and anti-racist action moving forward?
Yeah, thank you, Kurt. That's a really important question. And I think that one of the ways we have to do this is to start to, acknowledge the structural racism that exists. So if we want to talk about something as simple as redlining, for instance, I grew up in Texas. I'm going to link this story to Darren's really quick. I grew up in a petrol city, Texas City, Texas. And lots of us grew up together with all the chemical plants and sucking in all of that air and everything else. And if you lived on anywhere up and down the Texas Gulf Coast near the Houston Ship Channel, all of the communities, whether they were African American, Latino, and others, and the Vietnamese when they came in the 70s and 80s, we all experienced this because those were the places that were the easiest to live. They were the easiest places to buy homes. You weren't redlined out of those sections, and that put you up against all the chemical and petro plants that were there right there on the coast. And so that's one way to do this, is just to start to look at the living situations that people are in. I can think about places in Louisiana outside of New Orleans, same thing, petrochemical industry, Black and brown people living in these sections and areas. If we think about Katrina in 2005, where that happened and how everything flooded in the Ninth Ward, you start to see these places where people have been pushed into because they can afford to live there, but at the same time, there's industry and industrial things that are putting them at risk in terms of the environment. And I think that one of the ways we have to start to talk about this is in basic housing. Housing is really important in terms of this. The second, whether it seems to be related or not, and it seems a strange thing to talk about, is to talk about mass incarceration. Mass incarceration is a part of this because a lot of times what ends up happening is that you have structures of structural racism where you have Black and brown people, men and women, who are incarcerated on plantations and are expected to work in very terrible environmental conditions. So I think about places like Parchman, other prisons in Texas and in other places. You start to begin to see all of that. And so I think that's really important. The third piece about this is, what do these industries do themselves in terms of the kinds of people that they hire, and where does everybody work, and how, and what are those conditions in? If we start to think about areas in which people have worked either in petrochemical plants or in other kinds of environmentally unsafe places and still have a lot of things to think about in terms of cancer, rates of cancer, you know, medical care, all of that. We can start to see how that structural racism has really worked against people and has worked in a way to keep people in these kinds of economic situations where they are reliant on being employed in these places, yet these are the same places that are actually killing them and killing their families. And so I think once we begin to see how these things get put together, and then also the sense in which where people are in their churches and their churches are saying, well, we have to, you know, be able to, you know, take your tithe and your offering. And we hope that you're going to, you know, support big business, whether that's, you know, big chemical business or something else that's, you know, destroying the environment. I think in the sense of where people are being told that, oh, well, God's going to replenish the earth. That's just a fallacy. It doesn't exist, and it's not true. And I think that if you combine all of these things, the structural racism, the ideas that people are getting theologically, the economic stressors that make them have to work in these places, you have a situation that's very dire and does not lend itself to a kind of a lifestyle or a life that is healthy and that will end up being plagued with certain kinds of diseases that are come as a result of where you live and where you work.
I learned recently that a disproportionate amount of African-American debt is in healthcare as opposed to value-added things like homes,
Yeah.
which seems to be both a part of that cycle, but also
Mhm.
compounding that cycle as
Exactly.
well. Thank you so much. We have time, so let me take you back to the beginning of the film, if you will. Part of the story that we hoped would be told is a story of change over the past 25 years in the political opinions about climate change in relationship to religion. So the film opens with old ads featuring Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich on the one hand and Reverends Al Sharpton and Pat Robertson on the other. And the message of these two ads is one of agreement, of consilience. They imply that though there may be different roads to conservation, there's agreement that about the fact of the need for conservation. Where is that consilience today, and how might we amplify it to the extent that we feel that that's a valuable thing to be doing? And Anthea, can I start by asking you for some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think honestly, to me, where the conciliatory place is was with younger people, because they are the ones who actually really do care. I'm thinking about things like the Sunrise Movement. I'm thinking about, you know, Greta and lots of other, you know, college age and teenagers who are really starting to think about the environment in different ways and are really pushing their parents and their grandparents to get a grip, basically, and think about the world that they're leaving behind for them to take care of. I don't see, I have to be honest and say, in some ways, I don't see this coming so much from evangelicals in the same way as I'm thinking about the kinds of push that, the kinds of relationships that maybe younger evangelicals might have with someone, say, like Pope Francis, right? Because Pope Francis has been really, you know, saying things about the environment. And I think that is crossing, you know, religious sorts of lines. And if you will, and in a way, this is allowing people to do what, you know, sociologists would call frame bridging. They can bridge the frameworks that they already have in order to make this come together about the environment. I think the other thing, just briefly, that does this are these kinds of environmental events that are really touchy. So I think about Flint, for instance. Flint brought the big case of water to everyone. And what happened in Michigan was an absolute tragedy, and still it's happening, that people are still using bottled water. I think every time you show ice flow breaking or, you know, some kind of big news like that, that pulls people into this story in different kinds of ways and allows people to make alliances with others that they didn't think they would make alliances with before. So that's how I would see this happening. but as far as a bigger sort of political alliance, which I love that clip because I completely had forgotten about that had happened.
Mhm.
And so that was a really great way to open up the film. I find it difficult to think where we are right now, how that might happen. Maybe in the next administration that might happen, but I cannot imagine that right now in October of 2020.
Right. Well, let me ask you another question about that point. We see two conversion stories, so to speak, Inglis and Sijek in the film.
Mhm.
For myself, it's hard to imagine that that kind of conversion can happen as easily as it did 20 years ago. What do you think? Is that still possible?
I actually think it's possible, but the
Mhm.
way that it's possible is the way that most people get converted is something
Mhm.
happens to you, right?
Mhm.
And so I'm thinking about is, as a child of the Gulf Coast, what I think about is, the amount of storms we've had this year, where we're into storms that are named with Greek names now instead of just regular names, right?
Mhm.
And so every time something floods, every time, a natural disaster happens and people experience it, I think that can make you have a sort of a conversion experience about climate change because climate affects you. If you think about the fires in California right now, this is horrible. California has just been told that they will not get any federal aid and it's burning again. And so I think that the ways in which these kinds of things directly impact you, where you are sucking up so much smoke that you can't see outside, or you are wading in the water, or you are somebody in Lake Charles, Louisiana, who has to take the tarp off their house again and start over 3 weeks after having the last storm, then I think you begin to realize that, hey, this affects my life too.
Darren, are we in a space now where conciliatory efforts can be successful? What are the pathways to that happening again?
Well, I tend to be skeptical by nature, and in this day and age, very much so. I was encouraged, and I teach for reference, and anecdotally, I teach a course on the history of energy in American life here at Notre Dame. And, I will agree with Anthea in that Pope Francis, I think, has stirred up a lot of constructive, positive energy, no pun intended, among young people, especially within the Catholic Church. And so I'm teaching a lot of engineers, very smart engineers on the rise who are also concerned with sustainability. They're taking their faith, wearing it on their sleeve, and they're seeking to move into professions, including within big oil, in which they can still try to transform, policies related to climate change and the planet. And I remain in contact with them. So I see, in some ways, there's some hope there. I think there's a lot of kind of activism being generated at that level. Among young evangelicals, looking back in the Obama years, there was, I think, substantial kind of movement in that regard, including in the oil patches of North America. Young people from Texas and Oklahoma or Alberta, Canada, for instance, kind of rallying around Bill McKibben, 360.org, and trying to protest the Keystone Pipeline and so forth. I don't know where we stand with that now. There are other kind of communities. There's other kind of groups like Young Evangelicals for Climate Action that suggest that there is still a groundswell of that kind of activism. But in this polarized climate right now, I'm going to have to wait and see whether this is going to make a breakthrough or not. And related to that, I mean, I think we're dealing with a polarized political climate on the right. We're so driven, of course, by the politics of the body and abortion. And in some ways that we can trace that back to the late 70s, early 80s, concerns over energy, nuclear energy, for instance. There's a way in which the politics of the body took some of the potentials for activism, for politics of energy and environment away, and has in some ways limited the opportunities for that breakthrough within the conservative politics of the Christian right. So I'm not sure where we go next. As I say, I'm a historian, not a prophet, and I'm comfortable in playing that role. I think there are seeds of activism and potential for change there. but I'm going to have to wait and see what happens.
Jeanine, you chose to end the film on a positive note by talking about younger generations and different kinds of political and social action. Tell us something about your thinking in choosing to end the film that way.
Well, there's so many different ways we could have gone, so many stories that we could have continued down the line, and Anthea's work and Darren's book, hundreds of different storylines that you could go down. But our team made a conscious decision to make a turn and look to the youth and some of the people who are feeling, taking the overwhelming sense of environmental despair and putting it towards action in their everyday lives. And I think that there are so many environmental justice warriors in grassroots situations, so many stories, so many people working hard, caring, trying to create change. I thought we found, Kyle to be very compelling because young evangelicals for climate action are doing it in a slightly different way, that they are working on the political level. They're putting all their efforts into lobbying, in a sense, their political representatives within their Christian evangelical community to say, we don't agree anymore with this old line of thinking. And that, of course, is a very different story than being in a community where you're fighting for clean air, for clean water, for justice. And so I think for us, we felt like that was the rise of the moral majority and the impact that they had and the crossover to politics and the use of and wielding religion for so many of these issues, with the environmental movement getting caught up in that. We'd like to offer some hope that perhaps that old guard is out and there's a new generation coming up. And maybe that's Pollyannish and maybe it's a little optimistic, but it is happening on some level. And we just got the sense also, even from the individual stories and different politicians that we talked to in the past that had conversion moments, that on the issue in the environment, people would feel like if there was somewhat of a change in administration, or like felt a little more comfortable in the Republican community going forward, that the environmental issues there could be some common ground. We'll see. I don't know. I also think that there's an interesting story in the change between the environmental movement itself and how environmental justice and the environmental movement are trying to reconcile themselves as well. That it shouldn't just be about the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s that was caring very much about land and parks and open space, that it also should merge with the communities that Anthea has been talking so much about that have suffered the most at so many of the environmental policies. So we decided to go for a little bit of a hopeful end.
Thank you.
We took our cue from some of the people that we talked to.
Yeah. It's good, whether it's Pollyanna-ish or not. I think it's good strategy to be hopeful. One of the things I like about it in particular is the way the film moves from the multiple threads of story to a hopeful end, is that you can deal with complex problems and still maintain a sense of hopefulness. And I think young people are particularly good at that now, right? These are very complex problems.
Yeah, and I would just agree with Jeanine there. That's a great point. I think we're looking at one side of it, evangelicals and evangelical young people since the 80s kind of shifting to the right. A lot of the politics was generated, as they saw it, by the radicalization of the environmental movement. And in some ways they felt marginalized by that. If an environmental movement, if the liberal left within the Democratic Party, can come back and recognize its own God problem, if you will, there is a potential here to tap into, I think, a lot of entrepreneurialism and youthful energy within the evangelical movement, I think, to incite change, to generate change. And so it's going to have to come from multiple directions, I think.
You all have been very generous with your time, and I have one question remaining to close out our session here. What weren't we able to cover in the film? What connections should we be making that the film can only hint at if we want to educate ourselves more about the intersection of these issues? And Darren, can I start with you? And then I'll move to Anthea afterwards. What did we leave out?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think you did a wonderful job, as I've said, in 20 minutes, especially. I think it's beautifully orchestrated, and you know, I guess I would just, ending on a hopeful point. I mean, following Jeanine and Anthea and what I said earlier, I'm fascinated with the role of youth in this, and not just talking about evangelical youth or Catholic youth, but the very much interdenominational and ecumenical potentials of this too. People praying on pipe, you know, trying to prevent the Keystone. And again, having my own experience here, I'm not Catholic, but working with Catholic young people, their willingness to bring their faith into the politics of this movement and to work with people across other faith traditions. I think that's an exciting element of this, and I'm not saying that this is something that wasn't covered enough in the film, but looking forward, I think we can hopefully anticipate this kind of interfaith activism on a global scale.
Good, thank you. Anthea, what did the film leave out that should be here if we want to continue this conversation?
Yeah, I think one negative and one positive. So I'll say the negative first. The one negative I think that we could have maybe looked at a little bit deeper is the relationship to these funders to other kinds of conservative religious organizations. And when I say that, I'm thinking about, you know, Focus on the Family. I'm thinking about, you know, Family Research Council and others, which have promulgated a lot of what has happened in terms of thinking about climate change and other things, because they have lobbyists, they have money, they've gotten money from these organizations, and they're the ones who have helped, you know, as much as they have body politics, they also have body politics that's about, we need to push back against certain things because of capitalism. And I think that's one piece of that. The other part I'd say that I think that I wish we could have, I think is a hopeful piece, is that we often scoff at, you know, liberalism or liberal Protestantism or, you know, liberal Christians. And I think there is a very healthy place to have people who are thinking about this, not just like evangelicals who might feel like outliers to their own tradition, but I think there's a way to look at this in the main line and to think about how the main line maybe set the stage for a lot of this to happen in terms of what they wanted to do, you know, holistically. For every John Birch Society member, there's somebody else who was trying to do something and, you know, hug a tree or do all these things that we thought were like, you know, crazy things in the 60s and 70s. But I think they played a real role in trying to think about, you know, the precursors to climate change. And so if I were thinking about it, I think that I would want to include that story within it, because I think that lends a lot of nuance to what's actually really happening. And I think we discount that at our peril.
Good, great positive feedback from both of you. Jeanine,
go ahead. I agree with Anthea, and I was just also going to add the, not within the range of a 20-minute film, but the global dimensions of this and the pushback by people of faith globally, whether it's in Latin America or elsewhere, I think is also something to keep on our radar, as well as the flip side, as Anthea said, just the extent of funding into the politics of kind of carbon-based economics, whether it's in Brazil or the United States or Canada or beyond. So I think the international dimensions of this are yet to be kind of fleshed out and mapped out.
Good, thank you. Jeanine, no one knows better what you left on the cutting room floor. What is the next story that coming out of this that might enhance our understanding of these issues?
I think I agree with both Anthea and Darren in your assessment on that. And it could have just been 20 minutes just trying to introduce those issues. And so our approach was to touch on it, but I think I think the power of propaganda, the enormous and organized effort over the past 30 years to create sort of an army of climate skeptics and science deniers within these particular religious communities, and the mobilization to carry out those ideas in the ballot box is a story that feels like it needs to be expanded upon greatly, because it's a small portion of the population that had a big voice in the political ring. And I think the separation of church and state, which kind of gets embedded in all of this, is another really big story that needs to be looked at in our modern context right now, because it's been eroded in many ways. And so that is one area that we did feel like that could go into a whole nother series of documentaries just on that. But then as far as what was left on the cutting room floor, well, the beauty of what you guys are doing at the lab is you're going to allow those transcripts to be available. So people who want to watch eventually these full interviews, which were long and everybody was extremely generous with their time, you'll be able to have access to it. Right?
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Darren and Anthea, I want to thank you so much for taking your time to be with us today and for agreeing to participate in the film. Jeanine, I want to thank you especially for taking on this film and for creating such a wonderful snapshot of some very complex issues that are important to all of us today. Really, we're at the lab, we're much better for it, and we want to thank you and your sister Catherine for creating this piece of documentary art that's brought us all together here for this moment. So thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
All three of you, thank you for participating in this panel today. And those of you who are viewing, it's true, you will be able to engage with transcripts from the longer interviews that made up the film at religionlab.virginia.edu if you have any more questions about the work of our two guests, their work, or the ongoing work of the lab. Please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you so much and good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kurtis. Thanks, Jeanine.
Thank you.
Kurtis.